Hi, thank you for coming back to the channel. If this isn't your first time here, you probably know we talk honestly about our homes, our stuff, and how they quietly shape our everyday rhythm. Going into 2026, I realized something pretty clearly. My home isn't tired because it's messy. It's tired because I've been buying too quickly. Things don't arrive all at once, they come in slowly, on one small purchase at a time, each one feeling reasonable on its own. But added together, they ask my home to hold more than it needs to. This video is about going into 2026 with something very specific, a list of things you don't need to buy anymore, not to live with less for the sake of it, but so your home can feel lighter, your mind has fewer. The first thing I stopped buying was anything designed to be used once and tossed immediately. Paper towels and disposable wipes felt convenient, but they trained me to clean without thinking. I grabbed them quickly, used more than I needed, and then had to keep replacing them. The clutter wasn't just physical, it was the constant need to restock. What made the biggest difference was switching to a small, fixed set of reusable cloths and putting them where I actually clean. Fewer choices meant less grabbing, less waste, and fewer items lingering on the counter waiting to be used. Once I removed the most obvious throwaway items, I noticed another category creating the same quiet problem. Things meant to hold food temporarily, but never quite leaving the drawer. The next thing I stopped buying were single-use plastic bags, the kind that slowly take over an entire drawer. I used to save them just in case, and somehow that case never came. They piled up, got tangled, and turned into one of those spaces I avoided opening because it felt chaotic for no real reason. And every time I ran low, I bought another box, restarting the same loop. What changed was deciding that I didn't need endless options for temporary storage. I kept a small number of reusable containers and bags, and that forced me to reuse what I already had instead of reaching for something disposable. Once I saw how much calmer that single drawer felt, it became easier to notice other everyday items I was buying simply because they were easy to grab. Another thing I stopped buying was different cleaners meant to do basically the same thing. At one point, I had a spray for the kitchen, one for the counters, one for the stove, and another just in case. None of them were used up at the same pace, and they ended up scattered across cabinets and shelves, half full and forgotten. What actually simplified things was choosing one all-purpose cleaner and sticking with it. Fewer bottles meant fewer places to store them, fewer decisions while cleaning, and less visual noise under the sink. Once that area calmed down, I started noticing how many other just-in-case items were quietly asking for storage space without really earning it. Another habit I quietly stopped was buying small trash bags for every single room. It seemed practical, but in reality it created more clutter than it solved. Every bin needed refilling, every liner had to be stored somewhere. And I was constantly buying boxes of bags that took up space long before they were ever used. What worked better was simplifying the system, one main trash can with proper liners and smaller bins without bags. They get emptied regularly and nothing overflows or lingers. Once I reduced the number of trash systems in the house, it became much easier to spot the next type of purchase that was adding more maintenance than value. The next thing I stopped bringing into my home was bottled drinks, water, teas, and single-serve beverages meant to be grab and go. They never felt like clutter at first, but the bottles stacked up quickly took over the fridge and always left something behind to recycle or throw out. Even when they were gone, the habit stayed. What changed things was committing to a simple setup, one or two reusable bottles, and making drinks at home. The fridge felt lighter, the counters stayed clearer, and there was less constant turnover of stuff. And once I saw how much calmer the kitchen felt without all that packaging moving in and out, I started looking at other items that were only passing through my home without really belonging. Another thing I stopped buying was one-job-only cleaning tools. a cloth just for glass, another for dusting, another for this exact surface. They sounded efficient, but they multiplied fast. Each one needed its own spot, and suddenly cleaning meant choosing tools instead of actually cleaning. Half of them sat unused, taking up space and attention. What worked better was narrowing it down to a few multi-purpose cloths that I actually reach for. When tools are flexible, they get used, and when they get used, they don't turn into clutter. Once I removed the extra tools meant to make cleaning easier, I started noticing another category of items that claimed to help but mostly just waited around. One thing I stopped buying completely was organizing bins before I'd actually decided what to keep. Every time I brought home a new bin, it felt like progress. But really, it just delayed the harder decision. I was organizing things I hadn't chosen yet, and the bins themselves became more items to store. What changed was forcing myself to declutter first. Only after I knew what was staying did I consider whether a container was even necessary, and most of the time it wasn't. Once I stopped using containers as a shortcut, it became easier to recognize another type of purchase that looked harmless but quietly crowded my space. Another thing I stopped buying were containers that had no job other than looking nice. They always seemed harmless, a cute jar, a beautiful box, but once they came home, I felt pressure to fill them. And whatever went inside suddenly became something I had to keep just so the container wouldn't sit empty. What helped was asking one simple question before buying anything decorative. What problem does this solve in my daily life? If the answer was only it looks good, I left it behind. And after letting go of buying things purely for appearance, I started noticing how often I was tempted by items meant for someday, not for how I actually live now. The next thing I stopped buying were items meant for a future situation that hadn't actually happened yet. Just in case purchases felt responsible at the time, but they slowly filled drawers and shelves with things I rarely touched. Most of them expired, broke, or were forgotten long before they were ever needed. What shifted everything was realizing that my home didn't need to be prepared for every possible scenario. It only needed to support my real everyday life. Once I let go of buying for imagined situations, it became much easier to see which items were already asking for space without earning it. Another thing I stopped buying was a second or third version of something that was already working fine. Extra scissors, backup chargers, spare water bottles. Each one seemed useful on its own, but together they created crowded drawers where nothing had a clear place, and I spent more time searching than using. What helped was setting a simple rule: if I already own one and it works, I don't need another. When something breaks, then I replace it, not before. Once I stopped multiplying perfectly good items, I started noticing how often backup purchases were quietly making my home harder to manage. Another purchase I quietly removed was upgrading things that were still doing their job. A newer model, a slightly better design, a more efficient version, none of them fixed an actual problem. They just replaced something functional with something different and left me figuring out what to do with the old one. What changed was deciding that working was enough. I stopped treating improvement as a reason to replace, and my space immediately felt more settled. And once I stopped chasing better versions, it became easier to question another category of items designed to solve problems I didn't really have. Another thing I stopped buying were products designed to fix clutter instantly. Hooks, trays, small gadgets, they promised a fast solution, but most of the time they just shifted the mess around. Instead of fewer items, I ended up with clutter plus the tool meant to manage it. What actually helped was slowing down and removing the excess first. Once there was less to manage, most of those solutions were no longer necessary. After stepping away from quick fixes, I started noticing how many purchases were really just reactions to a space that hadn't been simplified yet. And if you're at the point where things already feel overwhelming and you don't even know where to start, I have another video where I clean and declutter a real mess step by step without trying to make it look perfect. Another thing I stopped bringing home were scented products meant to make a room feel cleaner. Candles, sprays, plug-ins, they didn't fix anything. They just layered a smell over whatever was already there and added more items to shelves, drawers, and outlets. What worked better was addressing the source instead of covering it up. Fewer products, fewer smells competing, and the space felt calmer without trying so hard. Once I removed things designed to mask problems, I became more aware of how many products were quietly adding steps to my daily routines. Another thing I stopped buying were products that only existed to add one more step to something I already did every day. Each extra step felt small on its own, but together they slowed everything down. More bottles, more tools, more decisions, all for results I didn't actually notice. What made a difference was trimming routines back to what I consistently use. When a product didn't clearly earn its place, it didn't stay. And once my routines became simpler, it was easier to spot other purchases that complicated life more than they helped. Another thing I stopped buying was having several products that all did the same job. Different sprays, creams, or tools for one task made me feel prepared, but in reality, they just competed for space. None of them got used up, and all of them demanded storage and attention. What helped was choosing one reliable option and committing to it. When there's only one choice, things get finished, replaced intentionally, and kept under control. After simplifying down to one product per purpose, I started noticing how much calmer my storage areas felt and how many other categories could benefit from the same rule. Another thing I stopped buying were items that entered my home through constant advertising. They sounded convincing, solved problems I didn't feel until I saw the ad, and always promised to improve something. But once they arrived, they rarely changed my day in any meaningful way. What shifted things was pausing whenever I felt that sudden urge to buy. If I hadn't noticed the problem before the ad showed up, I didn't need the solution. After breaking that habit, I became much more aware of how often clutter starts with a moment of persuasion, not real necessity. Another thing I stopped doing was stocking up excessively on everyday items. Buying in bulk felt smart, but it often meant cabinets filled with duplicates I couldn't see or reach easily. Instead of feeling prepared, I felt surrounded by things waiting their turn. What worked better was keeping only what I could realistically use within a short time. When supplies stay visible and manageable, they don't turn into background clutter. And once I adjusted how much I kept on hand, it became easier to notice which purchases were about comfort, not actual need. Another thing I stopped buying were items that had no purpose beyond being cute. They always felt harmless, small, charming, easy to justify. But once they came home, they needed a place, and that place pushed something else out of balance. What helped was separating appreciation from ownership. I can like something without needing to live with it. And after letting go of buying for cuteness alone, I started seeing how closely clutter is tied to emotional impulse, not practical use. There was a point where I noticed something uncomfortable. My home kept changing faster than I did. Trend-based decor always felt exciting at first. It matched the season, the mood, the internet. But that feeling expired quickly. And what was left behind was another item I had to store, rotate, or justify keeping. What helped was choosing decor that didn't ask to be replaced. Pieces that could stay quietly in the background without demanding an update every few months. And once I stopped decorating for trends, I realized how much visual noise had been driving the urge to buy in the first place. I used to tell myself that buying secondhand didn't really count. It felt responsible, budget-friendly, and harmless. But without a clear plan, those finds still came home and asked for space. Some of them never quite fit into my life, yet they stayed because they were a good deal. What changed was deciding that secondhand still needs intention. If I couldn't name exactly where something would live and how I would use it, I left it behind. And once I stopped letting "it was a bargain" be the reason, it became easier to notice how many purchases were driven by opportunity, not necessity. At some point, I realized a lot of my storage was holding plans, not belongings. I was buying things for the person I thought I would become, more organized, more active, more put together. But those items sat quietly waiting for a life that hadn't arrived yet. What helped was committing to support the version of myself I live as right now. When something didn't fit my current routines, it didn't come home. And once I stopped furnishing my house for a hypothetical future, the space finally started working for the present. There was a time when buying backups felt like peace of mind. Extra toiletries, spare tools, duplicates, just in case they promised security. But over time, they crowded shelves and drawers, turning reassurance into constant visual pressure. What changed was learning to trust that I could replace things when I actually needed to. Keeping less on hand made it easier to see what I truly had and use it fully. And once I separated preparedness from anxiety, I became much more intentional about what I allowed into my space. I noticed that unread books were quietly becoming their own category of clutter. Each new book felt like possibility, but together, they formed a pile of intentions I couldn't keep up with. Instead of feeling inspired, I felt behind every time I looked at them. What helped was making a simple rule: I don't bring in new books until I've finished the ones I already have. Libraries and borrowing filled the gap without adding weight to my shelves. And once books stopped accumulating, I saw how often I was buying motivation instead of giving myself time. I realized some of the biggest items in my home were also the least used. Ladders, specialty tools, bulky equipment, they sat idle most of the time, yet demanded permanent storage. Their size made them feel unavoidable, even though their use was rare. What changed was choosing access over ownership. Borrowing or renting when needed freed up space without limiting what I could do. And once I let go of storing things for occasional moments, my home started to feel more flexible and less crowded. I noticed how much space was taken up by things meant for events that happened maybe once or twice a year. Extra plates, serving trays, decorations, they stayed boxed up most of the time, waiting for a version of hosting I didn't actually do often. Meanwhile, they occupied storage I used every week. What helped was keeping only what fit my real style of gathering and borrowing the rest when needed. Hosting became easier when I wasn't managing excess in between. And once I adjusted to what I kept for guests, I started questioning other items I owned for rare occasions rather than everyday life. There was a moment when I realized my workouts weren't failing, my buying was. Exercise equipment kept arriving with motivation attached to it. But after the initial enthusiasm faded, the items stayed quietly reminding me of plans I wasn't following. What changed was choosing movement over ownership. Classes walking and using what I already had worked better than storing bulky equipment at home. And once I stopped buying motivation in physical form, I became more honest about what actually fits into my routine. I started noticing how many things I owned for situations that never actually happened. Flashlights, tools, supplies, bought with the idea of being prepared but rarely touched. They sat in drawers and closets, quietly asking for space year after year. What helped was defining what truly counted as an emergency in my daily life. Once I did that, most of these items no longer felt necessary to keep. And after clearing out imagined emergencies, it became easier to focus on the things that support my real everyday needs. I realized how many purchases happened in the exact moment I saw them. There was no plan, no gap, just interest turning straight into ownership. And those items often felt unnecessary as soon as they arrived, even if they seemed exciting at first. What changed was building in a pause. If something still made sense after a few days, I could come back to it. Most of the time, I didn't. And once I slowed down the speed of buying, I started noticing how much calmer my decisions and my space became. I noticed that the most stressful items were the ones that never quite belonged anywhere. They moved from counter to table to drawer, always temporarily there. The problem wasn't the item itself, it was the lack of a place waiting for it. What helped was deciding that if I couldn't name where something would live before buying it, it didn't come home. That single rule prevented so much future clutter. And once every item had a place, or wasn't bought at all, the flow of my home became noticeably easier. I started paying attention to how often one purchase quietly led to 3 more. A device that needed special refills, a container that needed matching inserts, a tool that only worked with a specific accessory. The original item was never the end of it. What changed was asking one question before buying, does this work on its own? If the answer was no, I left it behind. Fewer dependencies meant fewer things to manage later. And once I stopped bringing home items with hidden requirements, it became much easier to keep my system simple and stable. It became clear that some things were taking up space for moments that almost never happened. An item designed for one exact scenario sounds helpful, but most of the time it sits unused, waiting. And while it waits, it still needs storage attention and a decision about whether it stays. What helped was choosing flexibility over precision. If something couldn't adapt to more than one situation, it didn't earn a permanent place in my home. And once I stopped buying for edge cases, my space started working better for the life I actually live every day. I noticed that some purchases came with a full explanation attached. If I had to mentally defend why I needed something, the price, the deal, the potential use, it was usually a sign that it didn't really belong. Useful items don't ask for justification. They fit naturally into daily life. What changed was treating hesitation as information. If I had to convince myself, I paused, and most of the time I walked away. And once I stopped arguing for my purchases, it became much easier to trust my decisions and keep my space clear. I started noticing how often I bought replacements before the original was actually used up. Half-empty bottles, products waiting their turn, backups stacked behind backups. None of them were urgent, but together they made storage feel crowded and unfinished. What helped was setting a simple boundary. I don't replace something until it's almost gone. Finishing what I have creates closure, and it keeps new items from piling up prematurely. And once I slowed down replacement buying, I realized how much calmer my cabinets felt when everything had a clear beginning and an actual end. I noticed that some purchases weren't about using something, they were about calming a feeling. Buying made me feel prepared, organized ahead of life. But the items themselves often stayed untouched, while the feeling they promised faded quickly. What changed was learning to separate readiness from ownership. I don't need to own everything in advance to handle what comes next. And once I stopped shopping for reassurance, I could finally see what my home actually needed and what it didn't. The last thing I stopped doing was buying ahead of the moment things were actually required. Planning ahead felt responsible, but it often meant storing items for months, sometimes years before they were used. In the meantime, they took up space and attention without serving a purpose. What helped was trusting timing instead of anticipation. When a real need shows up, I can respond to it then, not in advance. And once I stopped filling my home with things meant for the future, it finally had room to support the present. Before we wrap up, I want to be clear about one thing. This list isn't about deprivation, discipline, or proving that you can live with less than someone else. It's about noticing which purchases quietly make your home harder to manage and choosing to interrupt that pattern. You don't need to stop buying all of these things. You don't even need to agree with every item on the list. If only 2 or 3 stood out to you, that's enough to change the rhythm of your home. A lighter home doesn't come from one big declutter. It comes from fewer small decisions piling up over time. And when your space stops asking for so much from you, your energy has somewhere to go again. Thank you for spending this time with me. If this video helped you think differently about what comes into your home, I'll see you in the next one. And if